Prayers.
Let us pray. Guide us, Lord, in all doings with your gracious favor. Further to your continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in you, we may glorify your holy name, and finally by your mercy attain everlasting life, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we beseech thee, upon thy servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that they may in all things walk before thee with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in their several offices, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And as we journey through this hurricane season, we pray for God's protection over us. God our Father, Creator of the universe and Lord over all creation, we humbly stand before you as your children in thanksgiving for your loving care and protection. We ask that you keep us safe from all dangerous storms and hurricanes that may threaten us during this season. Protect us from all fear and anxiety of storms, and give us an ardent trust and hope in your love and mercy. You alone have the power to command the sea, the wind, and the rain. You alone bring peace, calm, and safety. Father, we thank you in advance, for you are our only refuge. We ask this through Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Together we say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The sitting is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President. Announcements by Your Honor.
First of all, we have excuses for absence from Senator Chad Blackman, who is overseas on assignment, and Senator Walker, who is ill. Indications of late arrivals from Senator Maynard, Senator Thompson, and Senator Tate. I have received minutes of our meetings held on Monday, 11th March 2024, and Wednesday, 29th May 2024 to be confirmed. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the confirmation of the minutes of our meetings held on Monday, 11th March 2024, and Wednesday, 29th March, also 2024.
Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers.
We haven't put the question. The question is that the minutes of our meetings held on 11th March 2024 and 29th May 2024 be confirmed. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. Those minutes stand confirmed.
Presentation of petitions. Presentation of papers. Reports from select committees.
Senator Nichols.
May it please you, sir. I have the responsibility to report that the Joint Select Committee on Governance has been actively engaged in the consideration of the two bills sent to it. On the last occasion we met, we were able to conclude the review of all the public submissions that were sent to us, which we received in writing and also by way of the electronic platform, where we interfaced with a number of members of the public at large on this. We also had a meeting with with an officer from the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel to put together recommendations for amendments, and we have concluded that process. However, we are not yet completed. We have submitted the comments to the parent ministry, and the final report is being compiled at this stage. So we will now require a further time to sit and leave from the Senate to do so in order to conclude that business. Mr. President, I am being advised by the clerks based on the time to compile the report and for us to have our final meeting, I estimated another 28 days.
So just for the record, two things. Make specific mention of the full name of the committee, so Committee on Governance and Support, the bill under consideration, and the specific date. Because we got an extension to a date. It wouldn't be for X number of days. Just for the record and for the formal decision to be made. Thanks.
Yes, certainly, Your Honor. It is the Joint Select Committee, it's Joint Select Standing Committee on Governance and Policy Matters. And the two bills that have been sent for consideration will be Cybercrime Bill 2024 and the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Amendment Bill 2024. Out of the abundance of caution, I perhaps would request 6 weeks from today's sitting, just to be sure that we can have all of our business concluded before having to come back for another extension. The committee is scheduled to meet on Monday next, where we will go through the revised draft of the bill that was sent back down from the Office of the Chief Parliamentary Counsel. And then we will have our formal meeting with the substantive minister responsible for piloting these bills, and then conclude with the report to the Parliament. So I'd like to propose that we have a further extension of 6 weeks to conclude the business of the Joint Parliamentary Select Committee. I so move that motion, Mr. President.
Is there a seconder?
I second, Mr. Chairman.
Here we have Senator Watson. The question is that the Joint Select Standing Committee on Governance and Policy Matters be granted a requested extension for a period of 6 weeks from the date of today's sitting to submit the report on the matters under consideration, namely the Cybercrime Bill 2024 and the Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters Amendment Bill 2024. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The extension is granted to the Joint Select Standing Committee on Governance and Policy Matters for a period of 6 weeks from the date of today's sitting.
Questions to ministers. Request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance. Statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Personal explanations. Motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate moved by a minister.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I'd like to move the suspension of Articles 45.2, standing orders for 45.2 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Standing Order 45.2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The next the ayes have it. Standing Order 45.2 is therefore suspended for the remainder of the sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the following bills. The first reading of the Shipping Domestic Vessels Bill 2024. The first reading of the Criminal Procedure Amendment Bill 2024. The first reading also, Mr. President, of the Blue-Green Bank Bill. And that's it, Mr. President.
The question is that the Shipping Domestic Vessels Bill 2024 and the Criminal Procedure Amendment Bill 2024 and the Blue-Green Bank Bill 2024 be read a first time. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. The next the ayes have it. Those bills are accordingly read first time.
Public business, sir.
Public business is now the order of the day.
Order number 7, sir.
Order number 7.
Order number 7, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, and which has been assigned to Senator Dr. the Honourable S.M. Monroe Knight, to move the second reading of the Blue-Green Bank Bill 2024.
Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you so much for recognizing me as I stand to lead debate on this bill before us this morning. I must say, Mr. President, that I'm actually very proud to be leading this debate on the Blue-Green Bank. I don't know if we fully understand the fact that this is a major innovation in relation to climate finance. And Mr. President, I hope that through my presentation that I can provide more context and a greater understanding of why this is of such importance for us and for the region when we talk about climate finance and the need for innovation, the need for us to be able to mobilize the necessary finances to address the very real threat of the climate impacts that are facing us. Mr. President, there is a growing understanding and acceptance that the climate crisis and its impact is also a climate finance crisis. It is also a climate finance crisis. The question about how governments make room for, plan, budget for, and pay for the impacts of climate is one of the most important and challenging policy questions facing governments and countries worldwide. That is because the climate crisis, we call it an existential crisis. That means it threatens our very existence. is becoming the single most important challenge and crisis facing governments. And Mr. President, when we talk about that, it may again seem like something that doesn't concern the average person, that it is something that sits above us as individuals, and it is something that governments talk about, that governments need to pay attention to, but not something that impacts the average citizen. So, Mr. President, I want to be able to step back for just a little bit and talk about this whole issue of climate change and climate impact, and what does it mean? Mr. President, I don't think that there is any Barbadian, certainly not the Barbadians that I have met in supermarkets, at the gym, in my workplace. All of us have been feeling the impact of this heightened heat, Mr. President, all of us. And Mr. President, I want to say that I am one of those persons that I sweat all the time. I sweat from my head, a little bit of heat, and I be sweating. So you can imagine in this environment, how I am suffering. But I think all of us have been commenting on the fact that certainly for this year, we have seen an increase in the heat, in the temperatures. In fact, the analysis that has been done over the period 1984 to 2024, a 36-year period, suggests that May 2024 has been one of the hottest, has been the hottest month recorded over that 36-year period. And that also as well coincides with global averages as well when we look at temperature rises. This year, May 2024, over a 36-year period. Mr. President, that is climate change. And while in Barbados, no one has died from heat stroke, just last week we were learning that somebody says let's wait until Kadooment Day, but we cross our fingers and we will ensure, certainly as I wear the hat as Minister with responsibility for culture, as much as possible that we will ensure that there are sufficient measures to prevent that. But Mr. President, just last week we were learning that we had the death of over 1,000 persons that were traveling on their annual pilgrimage to the Mecca. 1,000 persons. In India, people have also died of heat stroke. Right across the US, we're being told that 200 million persons are at threat because of the rising temperatures. Schools are closing and allowing children to go home, again, because of rising temperatures. And even if we in Barbados believe that we can deal with the rising temperatures, I hope that we recognize that there are also other knock-on effects. Because what do? We go out, we purchase fans, we buy air conditioners. What does that mean? It means then that we place more stress on the grid, because we are pulling more electricity. But also as well, there's also a household cost as well, as we try to make sure that we are as cool as possible, Mr. President. But outside of the heat, Mr. President, right now the farming, the agricultural sector is under a drought warning for the period from January to May. And I have been told, and even though I am still grappling with it, that outside of that drought warning, there's also a hydrological warning as well, which will stay until the end of June, Mr. President. In Mexico and in the US, there are suggestions that very soon we will have a water conflict, because over an 80-year treaty between the two, they share water. And unfortunately, because of the drought that is happening, Mexico has not been able to deliver the water that it has promised, and that is creating conflict. And globally as well, we're noting that water is going to become the new commodity for countries to be able to trade. Mr. President, Who pays and how do countries mobilize the finance to deal with these issues? How do we mobilize the finance to ensure that the Barbados Water Authority can address the issue of non-revenue water loss, to be able to repair the burst mains, Mr. President, so that we don't lose the precious resource that we need? Mr. President, how do we make sure that we have a resilient housing stock? Who pays for that, Mr. President? Who pays to ensure that, as we have been told, that we are going to have a more intense hurricane season this year? How do we make sure that our island is secure, that homes are secure, businesses are secure, Mr. President? Records and cultural assets are secure. Who pays for that? If you listen to the international narrative, Mr. President, they would suggest that countries like ours, who contribute 0.01% of greenhouse gas emissions that are fueling the climate change, 0.01% is what countries like ours contribute. They would suggest to us that we need to mobilize resources from domestic resources. That is the narrative at play. I participate, as do others in this honourable chamber, in climate negotiations. And that is what they say to us. There was an independent expert group that was established to look at climate finance. And that independent finance group suggested that one of the first measures that countries need to be able to undertake is to mobilize domestic finance. That report, Mr. President, actually went on to say that for developing countries, that there is potential room for taxation. So essentially, what they are saying to us is that in order for countries like ours to be able to mobilize the necessary resources to deal with these very present and urgent climate impacts, that we should look to tax our populations more. That is what they are suggesting. Mobilize your resources, tax your populations in order to deal with the issues of housing, of health, of education, of infrastructure, of water. Mobilize private finance is what they say to us. First, mobilize your private finance resources. Mr. President, I don't think that, some will debate it, but I believe that generally we understand that we still have a developing private finance private sector, who is sometimes very adverse to risky investments. And again, all of the analysis, globally as well as in the region, indicates that the private sector is not flocking to put money into addressing and helping countries to address climate impacts. Because one, for the most part, if you're looking at the issue of mitigation, mitigation is long-term. And also as well, it requires a heavy and intensive amounts of revenue in order to be able to address. Mr. President, there was a report in 2023. It was called Beyond Finance, and it was looking at this issue of the provision of climate finance, particularly for the Global South. And what it showed, Mr. President, is that yes, there is finance that is mobilized, but where is it going? 75% of climate finance that is mobilized is going to the north, to the countries that are the biggest emitters. Finance is going to the north. Moreover, the finance is not only going to the north, it is staying. So that when capital is mobilized from those very same countries, it is staying where it is mobilized in the north. Because again, why? Countries like ours, because we are small, we just don't have the scale in order to be able to attract big private capital to invest. So even as we talk about mitigation, which is, Mr. President, aligned again to what we talk about transition to renewable energies, clean energy, those require huge amounts of investments and huge amounts of scale. And capital is flocking to those countries that can give them that scale going to the global north, Mr. President. Mr. President, that report also showed that for the global south, and when I talk about the global south, I'm talking about countries like ours within the region, we are financing 61%, Mr. President, of our financing for climate finance is debt. 61%. We have to borrow in order to be able to mobilize the finance that we need, Mr. President, to address some of the issues that I talked about before. The issues of how we deal with our water sector. The issues of our housing stock, Mr. President. The issues of our agriculture. Because if we talk about heat and if we talk about drought, we know that then that is aligned to declining yields within the agricultural sector, Mr. President. Animals need water, Mr. President, to survive. Drought, no water. What happens to our agricultural sector and the plans to be able to grow that agricultural sector as part of the diversification of our economy? So that all of these things are interlinked, and the question of who pays and how countries mobilize the necessary resources. So that report, Mr. President, like I said, showed that for us, we have to be able to mobilize capital through debt. Through debt. 34%, Mr. President, is provided through equity, and only 5% is provided through grants. 5%. Only 5% is provided through grants. That is what we are faced with, Mr. President. And we know from previous discussions that when it comes to concessional financing, Mr. President, we are also hamstrung, again, because they tell us because of our GDP that we can't necessarily have access to concessional financing. So small developing countries, not contributing largely to the climate change phenomenon, but challenged by it in a real and fundamental way across all sectors, Mr. President, across all sectors that you can think of, challenged by this phenomenon. But then, the options for us to be able to mobilize resources in order to be able to address it are hamstrung. In 2009, under the climate negotiations, those countries that were part of those negotiations agreed, Mr. President, they agreed to provide $100 billion in financing, $100 billion in financing for developing countries to help them address the very challenge that I've been speaking to in 2009. Mr. President, that financing was only delivered 4 years later. They delivered on that promise that they made in 2009 to deliver that $100 billion. Mr. President, it's like your roof is leaking in a major way. It's going to fall in. And you get an estimate for that leak. But you don't spend the money, you do a little patches here, you try to patch it there and patch it there. And 4 years later, you then decide that you're going to spend the money, but you're using the same estimate in 2009 in order to be able to get the resources to repay the leak. When that house, that roof, in 2009, because you were just patching, is literally more damaged than it was before. The cracks have gotten larger, Mr. President, and therefore, the analysis again suggests that in order to meet that challenge, we no longer need billions, we actually need trillions. Trillions of dollars, Mr. President. The estimate is that we need approximately $7 trillion annually, globally, in order to be able to deliver the financing that developing countries need to address their mitigation and adaptation needs, and also as well loss and damage, Mr. President. Loss and damage, Mr. President. When we talk about the issue of loss and damage, it is about how countries recover after a disaster. So the money that is available in order for us to be able to recover. And again, under those negotiations, a loss and damage fund was established. But we also recognize that to date it is still undercapitalized. So there's loss and damage, Mr. President. There's mitigation that I spoke about, again, which is long-term, and again, which has to do with us being able to implement measures that help us deal with lowering those GHG emissions, often through looking at measures, again, that have to do with clean technology, renewable energy, etc. Adaptation measures have to do with how do we address the immediate and future means by which we can protect and build resilience, again, across sectors. So if you look, Mr. President, at it as a leaky boat, if you do adaptation, what you're going to do is, again, try to be able as best as you can to plug those holes as much as you can. If it is that you are doing mitigation, you look for the very source of the leak, Mr. President, and you fundamentally try to address that. Again, but in some instances, that leak can be fixed immediately, and the amount of resources that is needed is going to be huge, Mr. President. And then what happens if the boat hits a storm and it breaks up altogether, and you need to fix it? That's your loss and damage, Mr. President. So we have this estimate in the trillions in order to be able to address the very needs of developing countries in order for them to be able to respond. Again, the question, who pays? How do we mobilize those resources? How do we mobilize the resources when, again, the analysis shows us that even as we know that we have this figure in the trillions, all of the figures indicate that official development financing, what we would call aid, is on the decline. Instead of doubling, is actually declining, Mr. President. The analysis would also as well show us that climate financing, again, is going mainly, as I said before, to mitigation and mitigation in the north. While for many of us, the high need is really for adaptation finance. The application of climate-smart technologies that former Senator Dr. Telston Brathwaite would speak very much about. How do we apply climate-smart measures, again, as an adaptation for the agricultural sector, in order as well for us to be able to adapt? Who pays? Can't tax. We're not supposed to borrow, Mr. President. Can't get concessional finance. The developed world that promised us that they will provide the finance has not done so to scale, even though some people look at that trillion figures and say, well, that's a lot. But remember that there are countries that have spent that amount, one country, in defense alone. One country in defense measures alone. So that trillion globally, Mr. President, even though it would seem like a lot because we're talking about millions of trillions of dollars, is really, when you look at it, really achievable. And this is exactly why the Bridgestone Initiative came about, in order to be able to provide a pathway for how this financing needs to be allocated, needs to be mobilized, and to address the fundamental issue of how we ensure that the global architecture is reformed. And Mr. President, again, one of the reasons why I say that I was proud when I began to be able to lead off this debate is because the only way for us, again, as a small country, to address this issue of how do we mobilize finances, how do we make sure that we have the adequate resources, is that we must innovate. Mr. President, we must innovate. Barbados, Mr. President, if you look at the recently, I don't even think it has been released as yet, the 2024 Sustainable Development Report, Barbados is number one. Barbados is number one on the multilateralism index. We are leading the world. This little country is leading the world in multilateralism as we provide leadership for how we will achieve the UN goals. This little country, Barbados. And it is primarily because we have given to the world, again, innovations in how we will mobilize finance. Mr. President, we would have learned already here that Barbados was one of the first countries to issue natural disaster clauses in its financing mechanisms. We would have debated and passed the debt for nature swap here in Barbados. The government is looking at climate swaps, Mr. President. And now we have the Blue-Green Bank, another plank of innovation in helping us to be able to mobilize the resources that are necessary in order to address, as I said before, the existential threat of climate. Because it is important for us, given all that we have learned about what is happening within the climate finance arena, to make sure that as a country, because we understand the fight that we are in, that we cannot just depend on the promises of the international community, but that we must create pathways of our own in order to be able to finance and to protect, Mr. President, our populations. Mr. President, I don't know, again, if we realize how fundamental this issue is. In Panama, people have had to be removed this year, from one of the small islands from Panama because of high sea level rises. Whole island, people have had to be removed, Mr. President. The danger of becoming climate refugees. Imagine, Mr. President, that we have a Category 4, Category 3 hurricane in Barbados in our current condition and the impact. And again, Mr. President, how do we rebuild? Who pays? How do we mobilize the resources? And the Blue-Green Bank is one of those mechanisms that the government is engineering in order for us to be able to mobilize the necessary capital. And Mr. President, I want to say that it is not just Barbados, we are innovating, but globally, countries are looking at various ways in order to be able to innovate and to mobilize this capital. Developed countries, Mr. President, across Europe in particular, are introducing carbon taxes. There is discussions, Mr. President, about a shipping tax to be able to tax, again, those large cargo ships that give off a lot of emissions. But Mr. President, guess what? Even though there is emerging consensus around that, what they are saying is not for the money to be shared to help us to be able to adapt and mitigate. They want to keep the money because they are saying it is important for them to clean up their act again. So they pollute, but then they also win, Mr. President. There's the development of carbon markets, Mr. President, green bonds. So a whole number of instruments we see globally as people try to make sure that they can crowd in the necessary finance in order to be able to make sure that we can meet that figure, be able to address the need for the climate finance that is ever so urgent. So that we face, Mr. President, a different kind of environment that we had before. And therefore, that different kind of environment requires that we need to be able to have different ways of how we are able to tackle it. And I understand that for some, dealing with innovation and dealing with new ways of mobilizing capital can seem, it's different, can seem challenging. When we are faced with the difference and the unknown, we can tend, Mr. President, to want to be able to retract. But, Mr. President, this government believes strongly that one of the critical planks that we have to be able to employ, as I said before, is innovation. It is innovation. The Blue-Green Bank, and Mr. President, it is intended to help us do a number of things. It is intended to help us mobilize the climate finance from different resources. So it's intended to be able to help us to crowd in finance from international development partners as well, corporations, Mr. President, large investors, under an umbrella that is also intended to be transparent, because we would know again from the bill before us that is intended to operate again with minimal government interference, Mr. President. I want to say that minimal government interference. It will be governed by a board of directors, and yes, the government will be able to appoint some of those directors, but those directors will operate independently. If we will look, Mr. President, at the bill, at Section 7 and Section 8, we will know that the bill sets specific parameters, again, in terms of the operations of the bank, in terms of how it can lend. It actually sets thresholds in terms of its risk profile, Mr. President, in order to make sure that the Blue-Green Bank functions, one, again, transparency, but also as well doesn't put us at risk, again, in terms of the larger debt profile. I also want to make it clear, Mr. President, that when it came to financing of this bank, we were able to attract, first of all, financing from the Green Climate Fund to develop the concept note and the parameters for the Blue-Green Bank through technical assistance, a technical assistance grant, meaning the government did not put any money as we sought to build out the framework for how the Blue-Green Bank would operate. Mr. President, part of the financing for the bank is $15 million from the government. But again, that $15 million is not new debt. That $15 million was part of a loan from the IMF under the Resilience Fund that the government signed in 2022, when it signed $183 million US, Mr. President. And we had agreed to be able to put aside that $15 million for investment in the Blue-Green Bank. So we are not incurring new debt in order to invest in the Blue-Green Bank. Mr. President, but we have others who have come on board in order to invest and to capitalize the Blue-Green Bank. The U.S. through the USAID has agreed to fund $2.5 million US to help with startup capital. Again, the Green Climate Fund has invested another $15 million US as well, again, to help with the startup cost for that bank. We have, Mr. President, Guyana, Bahamas investing. We have as well, Mr. President, CAF, the IDB. And what that shows is the level of confidence, Mr. President, that is being placed in this mechanism. So that to date, we have $77.5 million in startup capital. And the intent is that we will continue to be able to look for additional investors in order to continue the capitalization of the bank, Mr. President. Importantly, the intent of the bank is to allow us to be able to fund and invest in areas that have to do with, as I said before, equally mitigation and adaptation. Because I said there is a tendency to put money into mitigation globally as opposed to adaptation. Explicitly, the fund makes provision that the funds have to be applied across the board equally to address both the mitigation challenge and the adaptation challenge as well. Mr. President, if we look at the areas, again, under Clause 7, that identifies the areas of how the bank is supposed to function and what it is to invest in, you would see that essentially it is to allow us, Mr. President, to address those very things that I started asking about: who pays and how do we pay and how do we mobilize the capital. The investments, the money put into the Blue-Green Bank will help us, and I say us, Mr. President, not the government, but society, be able to address, again, building that resilient housing stock, addressing infrastructure challenges, those very burst mains that I talked about from the Barbados Water Authority, and making sure that those mains that are 130 years old, that unfortunately, Mr. President, still we're using today, and every day, Mr. President, unfortunately, I wake up again to an alert of another burst main, Mr. President. Pains the heart. But again, that is a cost for a heavily subsidized Barbados Water Authority. A heavily subsidized Barbados Water Authority, therefore, as well, is not in a position to be able to garner its own finance. So the government needs to be able to continue to finance it. So we're establishing a mechanism that would be able to crowd in that finance. And most importantly, not just crowd in the finance, but be able to lower the cost of the finance by leveraging all of the players within the international market in order to be able to do that, because that's an important part of the equation. One of the challenges that we face is the high cost, Mr. President, the high cost of the finance. And the Blue-Green Bank provides us with a way that we can be able to bring down that cost of finance. And it is intended that some of the resources that will be applied, Mr. President, will be applied through grants, Mr. President. Grants for projects that are intended to help women, intended to help households, Mr. President, as we transition from our diesel cars to our electric cars, Mr. President. Again, as we would have heard the Minister of Finance talk about, being able to support the taximen and the ZR drivers who also want to be able to transition. And now having a tool, the bank, that can help us to be able, again, to leverage that finance, crowd in that finance, bring in that finance, that would help us now to be able to invest in some of those real things. The investment that is needed in making sure that we get our program, again, Mr. President, for making sure that we can provide low-cost, resilient housing as an essential pillar for empowerment, because the things go together and they should not be seen as separate. One of the things with the issue and our challenge of climate, the climate challenge, the climate crisis, is that it is also as well tied up in terms of how we deal with and address all of those measures that are housed under the Sustainable Development Goals. Education, health, sustainable cities, Mr. President. Simple everyday things like making sure that we have good drainage. So that again, when we have those floods, that we can let the water run off. Mr. President, all of those things cost. And with an environment in which we are constrained about how we can mobilize those finances, the government is using this instrument as a way for us, like I said before, to be able to signal, one, again, to that global financial architecture, to those development partners, but also as well to persons involved in philanthropy. Because we want also as well to attract philanthropic money, Mr. President. Persons out there who are willing to give, and to give to the cause of addressing the climate crisis. So that again, we have a transparent instrument that would allow us to be able to do so. Mr. President, finally, one of the other elements of this bank that I want to be able to focus on as well is that while the bank will not provide for it, will not operate, Mr. President, like a normal retail bank that you would see on Broad Street, it will not operate in the same way as a CIBC, as a Scotia Bank. It is intended, as I keep saying, to be able to crowd in large amounts of capital, particularly whether it is from other governments, development partners, corporations, and the like. What it does provide for is that as we prioritize as a government those areas that have to do with allowing us again to be able to address the most pressing issues, that it does allow for us to be able to finance those projects and programs, Mr. President, that unfortunately, without being able to tax and being able to get concessional financing, we would have found it hard to be able to finance them. We can now house those under this instrument. And again, a transparent instrument that will provide for, again, an analysis of whether the project will deliver, and then, Mr. President, allowing as well for that financing, again, to be provided. So it means that, again, if you have groups, whether there are taxi operators who can come together, again, lobby government, lobby a government agency in order to prepare a proposal, that they have the opportunity, Mr. President, to be able to have an opportunity to be financed under this banking mechanism. So that, again, even though it does not function like a retail bank, the opportunities for it to be able to benefit Barbadians, Mr. President, is very real in its operations. And that, Mr. President, is something that I want to ensure that we fully understand. Mr. President, as I close, and as I commend this bill to this honourable chamber, I want to be able, again, to reiterate that point that I made at the beginning, is that as government is constrained, and as we look for new mechanisms, we cannot run from the fact that we will have to do things that are different. We will have to do things that perhaps we don't always recognize. But that search is not singularly us. It is happening throughout the globe. But what we are fashioning here under this Blue-Green Bank is a mechanism that works for us. It is a mechanism that allows us not to be just at the mercy of the promises of the international financial architecture, of the promises of aid, of the promises of those countries that said that they will deliver, and the history shows that they will under-deliver. But again, this provides a mechanism not only for us in Barbados, but to benefit right across the region in order for us to protect our own. Mr. President, I'm obliged, and I beg that this bill be read a second time.
Senator Watson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, my first remarks today are of a housekeeping nature. Mr. President, I am somewhat concerned, and I know similar concerns have been expressed in this chamber before, certainly before I was here, about the schedule that we are expected to keep this week in the Senate. We are going to meet twice this week, Mr. President, and we are expected to debate several bills, at least 4 of them, that will have a significant impact on Barbadians. And we received notice of 3 business days, just 3. And people may say, no, that's, when you really look at it, it's a week, but I think we should be allowed to have a life outside of the Senate. And so 3 business days to contemplate and prepare to debate complex new legislation dealing with the formation, funding, operation of a new banking institution. It's not a meeting turn. It's a banking institution, Mr. President. Regulation, registration of small vessels and water sports, devices, regulation of maritime, that's on the order paper, Mr. President. Water sports craft, so activities important to our main sector and that go to livelihoods of Barbadians, day-to-day activities. The Child Justice Bill, Mr. President, and legislation that is aimed at implementing judge-alone trials that will have a fundamental impact on our criminal justice system. It looks like a small bill, but it has huge import, Mr. President. And I tallied the pages because I wanted to understand. If I was doing this for a client, I would look at the time spending and I would bill for it. And 400 pages, 3 business days. Fundamentally important legislation. We're not going to belittle the legislation. I think it's important. Each one of them, I think we have to pay close attention to. And it doesn't end there. These bills contain, some of them, consequential amendments to key pieces of legislation in this country and cross-refer to other laws. So, for example, the bill that we're debating now, the Barbados Blue-Green Bank, cross-refers to the Central Bank Act, Financial Institutions Act, Financial Services Commission Act, and then it cross-refers to legislation that are referred to in those acts, Mr. President. And so if we did this right, we would have to be looking at those acts as well. Because we can't contextualize what we're looking at if we don't look at the other rules that will apply to understand if what we are doing will work. Because after we do what we're doing here today, these things will be operationalized. And we are not being afforded the opportunity to do that kind of work. We are being forced to engage in a cursory review and to pretend that we have properly examined these legislative initiatives. Mr. President, I have to tell you, I am annoyed. I'm trying really hard to not display it. But I think this is really serious. And it is not, this is something that I actually was contacted about several years ago when I was a brass tacks moderator by a member of the current administration who is currently in the other place about the challenges of having legislation given to you on the same day. or a couple of days before, so it's been going on for a long time. It was not okay then, when it was another administration, and it is not okay now.
Mr. President, on a point of order.
Yes, Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, the challenges to which the Honourable Member, she is misleading the Honourable Chamber. The House of Assembly has debated several of these measures weeks ago. Both houses of Parliament, the lower and the upper house, receive all the legislation at the same time. And so, however long ago the House of Assembly and the other place would have received this legislation, the Honourable Member would have received it at the same time. And it is on each individual member to take notice at the time it is raised and it is debated in the other place. Several weeks have passed before this sitting of the Senate was called, and all of us have had the same amount of time with the same responsibilities and the same obligations, and we've come here to do serious business, and I expect that all of us will do the same.
Please proceed, Senator Watson.
Mr. President, thank you. I am very thankful for the intervention of the Leader of Government Business, because I will say this, notwithstanding that it is laid in the lower house and that it is notified to us, that does not mean we're going to deal with it immediately, and we are not here twiddling our thumbs, none of us. So that means that we are going to look at when it is scheduled for debate. Right now, on the order paper, we have legislation that was debated weeks ago and put on our order paper, and we have not even glanced at it. So it is unreasonable, and it is also incorrect to suggest that we all have the same opportunity, because while the government members have 30,000 public servants who can write their speeches and contribute to them, we do not, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I rise on a point of order again.
Order.
Public servants and civil servants have no business at all, Mr. President, writing parliamentary speeches for ministers. That is not the matter before the Honourable Chamber. I can say without fear of contradiction, I, as a minister, a member of cabinet, and even before I was a member of cabinet, when I was a senator in this house 6 years ago, I have never had a public servant write a speech for me, and that is grossly misleading, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Senator Watson, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will repeat. The senators on the government side has access to those resources. We do not have the same access. The point is that, well, maybe it's not their job. Maybe they don't write your actual speech, but I know we have sat in here on this side and observed members from the government come back in speeches to give statistics that we do not have access to. This is a fact. And to pretend that that does not happen, because we see it, we see them on their devices looking at that information.
Mr. President,
it's information we do not have access to,
I rise on a point of order, Mr. President.
What's the point of order, Senator Cummings?
Mr. President, I know that it is the way of the opposition, the Honourable Members list meeting in the House, I know it is the way of the opposition, Mr. President, to make a point and then switch and bait and say something that wasn't said. But the reality of it, Mr. President, is that they do not, no one in the public sector writes our speeches, and that the availability of a member to use their devices to call an agency to ask for data to support their research is open to all, Mr. President, to all. You can call any research department as a member of this chamber and you can get data. In actual fact, Mr. President, most times you may not even have to do that. The central bank reports for economic report are published publicly. The data on balance relate before Parliament are on the public websites, Mr. President. It is about research. We come, we take the time, amidst all the things we have to do, to put in the work.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Please proceed, Senator Watson.
Mr. President, the Honourable Senator cannot at all be suggesting that the people on this side don't put in the work. We put in the work. We put in the work. And I will say this, Mr. President, the Honourable Member is deliberately misunderstanding me. And the Honourable Member must know that we do not have access to the resources that the people on the government side have. That is incorrect to say. That is misleading, Mr. President. But I will also say this, because I will go on. The fact of the matter is, we do not get the opportunity that we should to deal with these serious matters. And we're talking about a blue-green bank that the government referred to in its 2018 manifesto. So they knew that they were planning for it for 6 years. And we get a couple of weeks to look at it and talk about it. And it cross-refers so much legislation, important, complicated legislation, Mr. President. They can laugh, but it is not funny because we are here to do the people's business. And this is a gloss over of the people's business. It is not funny at all. It's not funny to me. When we look at the Criminal Procedure Amendment Bill that I was notified last night, we will be debating today, when I expected to debate it on Friday, and I know the Honourable Member will say that I suggested that. What I suggested is that we switch around the agenda. But here's the other thing that happens to us. We have a notification of an order paper, and then we come in here to find out what we're debating. Many days. So we do not even, in fact, the first time that I have gotten an email that could say, you can expect to debate this, and that has changed today. That is not a courtesy to write me in the evening before to say we are changing what was notified to us. That is not the discussion. The discussion is, why are we meeting 2 days this week? Why do we have a notice that says Blue-Green Bank and the Child Justice Bill that we were to have debated 2 weeks ago is second? So all the preparatory work that we would have done for that, we will have to back burner and come and prepare at short notice other remarks in the Senate. Let me be clear about what my suggestion was. And so we have these issues every time. We have to come in here on the morning of the debate to find out what we are debating. It is not reasonable. It's not reasonable for any administration. I don't actually care which administration it is. We can do better, and we must. And while we may say we're going to meet on a Wednesday, we don't know that we're going to meet on every Wednesday. Nobody is sitting down on this side twiddling their thumbs, Mr. President. And it is unfortunate that it continues, because I certainly expected that this administration would do differently. So we come in, we hear the standing order that requires time to pass between the first and the second reading is suspended. It happens every time. So we get a bill and we debate it. We have the first reading, the second reading, the debate, and the third reading, Mr. President. So that right now we could repeal that particular standing order, because we don't use it, and this is not okay. I am saying it is not okay, not just for me and for my colleagues who are the independent members, because apparently the government members are fine with it, but I'm saying it is not okay for the people who are expecting us to represent their interests. It's not just about passing the legislation and saying we have a busy legislative agenda. It is about making sure that the people are protected. When we look at the Criminal Procedure Amendment Bill, Mr. President, we are talking, it is a bill that actually appeals other bills. So what we are talking about, amends. So what we're talking about is a bill that refers to amendments to the Theft Act, Sexual Offences Act, Offences Against the Person Act, Evidence Act, Criminal Appeals Act, Mr. President. And in order for us to understand what the amendments are, we would have to go and look at those acts. I suspect only the lawyers would bother to do that. And we don't have the time to do it, because we're going to do a major legislative initiative today. It's important. And then we're going to come today to deal with legislation that is going to be a fundamental change to our criminal justice landscape. It is not to be scoffed at. Grinning and making jokes about it is annoying to me, because the people...
Mr. President, please, on a point of order.
Partly rise.
On a point of order. All of us come to this chamber, Mr. President. Sorry, on a point of order. The idea
what's the point of order?
The idea that was just mooted, that this side is scoffing and laughing, Mr. President, and somehow, therefore, not taking the issue seriously, Mr. President, is extremely insulting to all of us on this side, who also take this work and the work of the chamber extremely seriously, Mr. President. So to give the impression, and to have the impression given publicly, that there is in this chamber on this side some level of levity in relation to us handling the seriousness, Mr. President, is an injustice, to the chamber and certainly to this side, Mr. President, and which we know from here is not the case. It is not the case, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Morvenite. Proceed, Senator Watt.
Mr. President, thank you. In response to that, I will say good, because then that means that we will see a different way of operating when it comes to debating bills in the Senate. That is what I'm saying. Anybody getting offended about it is not the response. And this is something that we have heard outside and inside of the chamber. It is serious, Mr. President. I think it is disrespectful of the work that we are asked to do. And what we are being asked to do is actually not possible, and it is egregious for the government, and by that I mean the government of Barbados as a governance entity, to function in this way. It is not okay. And we are not keeping faith with the people of Barbados if we remain silent on the issue. And it is a long-standing issue, and the government is able to fix it, Mr. President. That is what I'm asking for. I am asking for us to also understand that we are not protected from the legislative initiative. So when they talk about keeping faith with the people of Barbados, we are not protected. We are not under some force field. We are talking about legislation that oftentimes criminalizes activity that we in here engage in. And we don't even get an opportunity to consider that. So it will affect the big boys, the ones in the middle, and the ones in the I won't say bottom, all of the others, Mr. President. This is serious. And a lot of the time what happens is that the legislation rushes through, you have a cursory debate, and then months later somebody says, oops, why didn't know that that was part of the law? It seems sometimes that even government members say, well, I didn't even realize that was happening. And we have to do better than that, Mr. President. And I'm appealing to you, Mr. President, because your word is law in this chamber. And I think we have an opportunity to confront the issue and do something different for the sake of our country, especially in a situation where we do have a jam-packed legislative initiative agenda. I don't think that that's a bad thing, because the government is pushing ahead with its work. But that means that we have to be vigilant, extra vigilant, because there's so much that is passing by us that affects Barbadians in their daily lives, Mr. President. I'm going to move on, but I'm asking you, please, Mr. President, to let this chamber have an eye to this issue and address this issue. We cannot go on like this. Mr. President, the Blue-Green Bank bill. We know that this law is going to pass because, well, the government has the numbers. And it doesn't seem as though they have a choice. It doesn't actually seem as though the members on the government side can oppose anything that the government does. So they will wax eloquently, and we heard it already. They're going to be the usual talking points. We're going to hear certain phrases and words: resilience, sustainability, climate change. Thank heavens we can have access to loans and financing. We have a global presence, thankfully. We have the Prime Minister, hallelujah. But, Mr. President, we also are talking about an initiative that is going to have a serious impact on the people of Barbados. Positive, I agree, and I'm going to say this so that the members on the government side understand very clearly. I will vote in favor of the Blue-Green Bank Act bill because it is important, it is developmental, and it can be used for good. And that is what I want to talk about in here today. Not good that is cloaked in buzzwords, but practical and policy initiatives that can redound directly to the benefit of the people of Barbados. Mr. President, so I will say, when we get past the flowery speeches that we've heard for 6 years now, where's the beef? Barbadians are going to say, what is in it for me? And that is the question that we have to answer here today. And Mr. President, we've been here before. I've already said that this is essentially a development bank. It's going to have a particular focus. But its focus is what we think we need to do to transform our economy and to protect our country for purposes of sustainability, food security, resilience, national security, addressing the impacts of climate change. So yes, it is important that we have a bank that is going to look after our interests in this way. And even though it is cloaked in climate policy, this new initiative, we have been here before with a development bank. And Barbadians of a certain age and above will know what way went that development bank. We know the stories are legend. People who are connected and included access funds. The recovery was lacking. The bank closed. Barbadians left holding the bag. So we absolutely don't want to see that. There are a lot of provisions in here that would suggest it can't happen, but I dare say that was the situation before. So what we want to know is what directly will be the benefits that we will see in our day-to-day lives as a people, Mr. President. And when I look at that element of what is the benefit, I want to refer to a more recent example. It's not a development bank, but it's a bank, an organization, an SOE, and a project that exists in this realm, renewable energy and energy efficiency. And I'm talking about the Smart Fund, administered by the Enterprise Growth Fund Limited. I'm not sure which number fund we're in, but I'm going to talk about number 1. The members on the other side will probably get excited because that occurred under the Democratic Labour Party. That's not the issue. The issue is what happened with the fund, because we're looking at who will benefit from the fund. And I'm using it as an example to say we cannot that way go. Again, let us talk about that fund. That fund had particular parameters for accessing loans, concessional, or grants. It's a fund that was capitalized with 20 million Barbados dollars from the Inter-American Development Bank. And we're talking about Enterprise Growth Fund. It's not a fly-by-night organization. It is a statutory corporation that has a good reputation, solid. It has stood the test of time. It's doing its work. And the rules included targeting small and medium enterprises, as well as the residential sector. And key eligibility criteria for accessing that fund was that applicants must demonstrate that the company is not in a financial position to fund the technical assistance from its own resources, not in a financial position. Mr. President, I want to talk about some of the beneficiaries of the technical assistance grant, not a loan, the grant. Bico Limited, Caribbean LED Lighting, Carter's & Co., Chickmont Food, Mr. President, Lens Tech, excellent business, Massey Stores, Unicomer Barbados Limited, we know them as Courts, but it's not a local company. Those are the small and medium businesses that got a grant, Mr. President. So when we talk about who will benefit, we have to ensure that when we set criteria, we stick to that criteria. Mr. President, that is, when I look at that list, it makes me smile. Because maybe there are some residences on the list that I see, but all of them, there's only one I can see here that on the list that I'm looking at that it seems to be an individual. They're all businesses. Some of them are small businesses. And what was that applied to? In some instances, they were to buy commodities to resell. And there's no evidence that we benefited from any cost savings being passed on to Barbadians, Mr. President. So we're talking about direct benefits that we can feel as we live our lives in this country. So yes, we've been here. That is not controversial. My submission here, Mr. President, is that we as voters, taxpayers, nationals must understand where these kinds of initiatives will benefit us. First, I want to say, Mr. President, that we must see, because RE feature is writ large, and energy efficiency, energy projects is writ large in this legislation. We must see that the levelized cost of energy remains affordable for Barbadians. We are not on that trajectory, Mr. President. We aren't. I can't fathom it, Mr. President. And right now, what we are seeing is that international organizations examining the impact of disbursements from these funds are saying the same thing. The cost of energy must be kept down, Mr. President, and that is not what we are doing. The only beneficiaries can't be those with money to install RE systems or to invest in large energy projects. Those projects are increasing across our landscape. Also increasing is what we pay for electricity. And some might want to imply that that is as a result of the cost of fossil fuels going into producing electricity and the issues that we have in shipping. We keep hearing that. Mr. President, that would be a lie though. To say it is only related to that. That would be a deliberate attempt to ignore, and convenient, to ignore the fact that high feed-in tariffs are being set in Barbados with high rates of return for RE and storage, and that those rates are charged directly to Barbados's ratepayers in the fuel clause adjustment. The same one through which we are charged for fossil fuel used to generate electricity. I want to make that clear so that Barbadians aren't fooled by that anymore. We are paying for renewable energy through the fuel clause adjustment. In fact, Mr. President, it has gone so ridiculous that our electricity supplier is even asking for us to pay for devices, batteries, fossil fuel batteries, generators, Mr. President, through the fuel clause adjustment. That's where we're headed. And something has to be done about it. We cannot talk about this kind of initiative and ignore the working elements of it. So it's not just about who are the directors of the bank, where it's located. We have to make sure that when we give money to operators in our market, whether through grants or concessional loans, that we can see returns, Mr. President. The returns cannot only be for the business people, the shareholders, the people with money who don't concern themselves about if they can pay the electricity bill or if they can afford to go and buy food because the supermarket's electricity bills are high, because the cost of cooling is high, and that environment must be a climate-controlled environment, Mr. President. These are real things. And the minister talked about temperature increases. She said it made her head sweat, right? Bajans are sweating. Sometimes you walk in from outside and you can't believe how it feels. Sometimes when you walk outside, you can't believe how it feels. And so Bajans, for several purposes, including productivity, because we're talking about people at work, we must keep cool. We're going to want to keep cool. And that is fans, that's AC units for those who can afford them. More power, increasing your electricity bill. To just survive, that goes to our well-being, health and well-being. It goes to the cost of goods and services. very importantly, because again, the minister referred to water and the importance of water, the electricity company's largest customer is the Barbados Water Authority, and their largest cost is the cost of electricity. So that means that if their cost continues to go up, we are going to bear the brunt of that. We will have no choice. So all of these things are linked, Mr. President. And we have to ensure that what we do as we engage in these initiatives, that the people can come along because they feel like it is about them, not just about brownie points or investors making money, and maybe we get some taxes. And I will say this in that regard, we are not compensated by license fees, Mr. President. License fees can't even cover regulation. So, and we've not looked at that as a matter of policy as far as I can see. I know, in a previous role, I have raised that with the government of Barbados, both the previous administration and this administration, and it does not appear to me as though it is being considered, but that's important, because you would normally say your license fee must cover the cost of government regulation. So we can't give them a pass and then we give them concessional financing and then we let them have high rates of return, Mr. President. Something has got to give in the interest of the people. Now, Mr. President, that issue of how we deal with who gets the money and what we get back in return. Like with the Smart Fund, we are seeing large, wealthy businesses seeking and receiving concessional financing under the Global Climate Fund initiatives. I'm going to say that because I'm not talking about the fund itself at this time, but there are many such funds. And they've existed for a while, it's not new. And they're getting concessional financing, but they're also getting grants for large projects. But they're at the same time expecting high returns for their projects, Mr. President. And I'm going to give a current example in Barbados, where the Fair Trading Commission embarked on a public consultation in relation to a company called Renewstable. It's a joint venture between two companies, one of which is Rubis, one of the largest oil producers on earth. They have gotten concessional financing from the Global Climate Fund, 2.5% debt, and their grant. And they have come to our Fair Trading Commission to ask for a rate of return of 10.4%, higher than even Barbados Light and Power asked for. That's what we're facing. Now, I have responded to that consultation because, well, I do these things. I'm concerned about how this is affecting the people. I have written to the Fair Trading Commission on a technical point because in my view, they cannot even be before the FTC, and the Commission cannot consider what they have asked for because they are not licensed. And that is clear from the consultation paper. So how, if the FTC only regulates service providers, can they contemplate a non-service provider's request? But as importantly, Mr. President, we have to seriously consider what our consumers are being asked for. And I know there are people that will say, I'm a one-trick pony. I only talk about electricity, but electricity is everything. We are feeling it in every good, every service that we buy. And then it feeds into other essential services, Mr. President, water, telecommunications, you go by the hospital, everything. So if we are not charging, let's say, for coming into the hospital for healthcare services, but their costs are going up, it must affect what they can deliver. And so, no, electricity is not a one subject issue. It affects everything we do in this country. And we have to take it that seriously, Mr. President. And when we talk about, what have we talked about? Agriculture, tourism, every industry that we have developed or that we're looking to develop, high-tech industries that are energy hogs. We cannot be competitive if our energy prices are rising and other countries' levelized cost of energy are going down. That's what the statistics show, Mr. President. We are anomalous. It does not make any sense, Mr. President. And we cannot talk about just transition. Everybody's talking about just transition. The global entities, other governments, financing companies, just transition, affordability, and our prices are going up. Just transition, and the average man cannot see where the justice is for them. Justice in two respects: the actual cost and the opportunity to engage with the process. Because we are not right now facing in this country a regulator that likes to shut up the consumer. Nobody could tell me I am wrong. And we are facing a government that has actually passed legislation to say they will go around the regulatory process if it suits them. How can it be just if licensing, rate setting does not allow the average man, who must be an interested party? The lawyers in here will tell you that the courts define that very broadly. If you are saying, I'm going to shut them out so that I can facilitate an investor making money, that is not just. Justice requires inclusion, Mr. President. Engagement, participation, and ability to have a say in your own business, and electricity is our business. If it was up to me, it would be our business for true, because we should own that business as a people. But that is a debate that will occur at another time, because we have to come in here about that issue. Mr. President, in addition to that then, we're talking about, can we afford to pay for this transition as regular folk? Can we afford to live, given the cost of living and the impacts of electricity on that? And can we participate in our process? And anything that results, any action of the government that results in a no to any of those questions, means that we are paying lip service to the idea of a just transition. The just transition cannot only be for the political class and capital, Mr. President. It has to be for the least of them all. That is what it means, Mr. President. And we can throw around terms like we're going to help women and we're going to help children, but it has to be real. And it's not just about if a person can get a small business loan and do a little something. It has to be about survival. And we have to be able to not just pay our bills, because that's not enough. We have to be able to create wealth, to actualize the normal term is living our best life. Every Barbadian has to have that opportunity, and that's not happening, Mr. President. And we are seeing it in how it is affecting crime in this country, because notwithstanding that we have heard in this chamber that poverty does not affect crime, it does. The statistics show it globally. If you feel you don't have a future, you can't get what the other person over there gets, that is going to cause a feeling of desolation. And there are behaviors that emerge from that, Mr. President. So all of these things go together, and we have to treat it as such. They're not operating in silos. And we, for example, have a proposal for a waste-to-energy plant. So now we're talking about two big ticket items that relate to sustainability and resilience and climate. Energy production, taking care of our waste. 49 cents per kilowatt hour is the proposed price in an environment where the cost per kilowatt hour of energy is 28 cents. Mr. President, 28 versus 49. Again, contributing to an increase. That's not acceptable, Mr. President. And we also cannot have, we've heard it more than once, or the jure Minister of Finance tell us that we must accept high costs of electricity to fuel, no pun intended, the transition. No, we do not. And we have policy tools that can impact that, and we have to engage them. Somebody's going to ask me how. Well, I will say this, when you come to the bank, you have to have a business plan. The same way as that joint venture has gone to the FTC and said, we want 10.4%, and here is the loan that we have, and we have a grant and all that. When you come by this bank, you must be saying, what are you looking at as a return? The bank might not say, no, we're not going to give you the loan, but the bank may say, okay, but here's what we want for it. We want a share, Mr. President. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But the bank could also say, but you're getting savings from us. How are your customers going to benefit from those savings? And we want that in detail, numbers, things we could calculate to say, okay, you are an acceptable customer for us because you are partnering. Partnering doesn't necessarily mean that the government is going to be out there, I don't know, laying concrete. But the government could be saying this is the benefit to my people that you have promised to me and inked that promise in order for you to get this loan. And those conversations must occur, Mr. President. But in addition to that, we have other mechanisms for ensuring that we benefit directly. I'm going to speak of only two today. Mr. President, when we started on the renewable energy and energy efficiency journey, we had a cadre of small business people. In my household, we call them the white van man, or I guess women. They were about the place. A lot of them were actually former work colleagues of mine who had left the company, had a little money, and started businesses. Mr. President, they have essentially disappeared from our business landscape. What has happened is that there is a consolidation in the market of electricity, RE installers and energy efficiency consultants, where we have about 3, Emera, Williams Industries, a company called SolarWatt. Maybe the small white van people get some crumbs. I won't even say scraps because it's not that much. Crumbs from their work. But we have allowed market consolidation in an environment where many small business people could participate, and we're encouraging young men and women to go to SJPI, train in this area to go and be employees when we could be facilitating them becoming business people. Mr. President, sometimes I just cannot believe that we are still here. And I know of companies that have not even been able to make it past the expression of interest stage for government projects. Knocked off, you're too small to do this. And then they get a call from some foreign entity that was sent to them by the same people to do work as, I don't know, laborers, I guess, or the brain trust, because sometimes the entity that comes to them don't have the experience. People that we have spent money to teach, who stay in our country, which is what we want, and we would tell them no when we are spending government money. And that vexes me because every single administration says we're going to use procurement to enfranchise Barbadians. That too is in the Barbados Labour Party manifesto for 2018. It's an explicit statement. And then we engage in telling our people, no, not you. You're too small. You don't have the experience to give money to companies who gain experience from what? Government procurement. That's what we do in our country. Mr. President, Senator Paris wants to make sure I put my hand in my Kimbo when I'm addressing you, so I'm going to try not to. I get passionate about it, Mr. President, and that's a Bajan thing. We do it. But I think this is very serious because, and I will keep coming back to it, because I think it is a real policy tool that we have. And we have grown some solid businesses using government procurement. And we have to use that tool for other people, not just saying we gave them a trust fund loan for $5,000. We're talking about contracts in the hundreds of millions of dollars, tens of millions, 5-figure, 6-figure. Not 5, but that's small. 6, 7-figure, Mr. President. We have to let small people have the opportunity, and we have to facilitate them. So, for me, This bank would really impress me, convince me that it's about the people if the first thing it did was to say, here's a grant for some REs and installers. I want small companies. If you're above this threshold, don't bother come. And I'm not talking about a loan. They can give them a loan too. I'm talking about a grant. Let them get off the ground. Government, give them some contracts if they're installing solar wherever. Or require the people who are coming with the big projects to subcontract the businesses that we have facilitated through a grant from the Barbados Blue-Green Bank. That would be real, Mr. President, because those people will work, they will employ people, they will shop, they will send their children to school, all of that stuff. And they will feel proud. They may be able to go out there in their communities and say to young men and women, come, I will teach you the technical elements and teach you the business elements and continue that, and they too can grow. So we have an opportunity. That's why I'm supporting the legislation. Not just the concept, but because it is a potential tool. The other thing, Mr. President, wealth for the people. This administration, Barbados Labour Party, in its 2018 manifesto said this: and I quote, many capitalist economies rely on trickle-down methods of economic growth from the haves. I didn't mean to point at you, Senator Malalu, to the have-nots. Our approach will stimulate the economy from the bottom up. We will create new wealth that results in a national cascade. And one of the other promise mechanisms, because public procurement was one of the other promise mechanisms was a Barbados Sovereign Wealth Fund. I quote, a Barbados Sovereign Wealth Fund will be created to ensure national wealth is available for present and future generations of Barbadians. The BSWF will hold government assets, including real property, etc. The fund will ensure appropriate professional long-term management, development, and returns from those assets. A percentage of the revenues of petroleum product will flow to the fund to ensure oil and gas earnings are not squandered or frittered away, but will become a source of funding for Barbados' long-term development. After its establishment, every Barbadian upon turning 18 will become entitled to a stake in the fund. Over time, this stake will produce an income or could be used as collateral for loans, for housing, and other specified purposes. Excellent. We get excited. Our imagination is fertilized by that. We hear nothing about that fund today. Where is it? Well, I will say this. That fund ought to be established. I can't say must, but it ought to be, because it was an excellent idea. And when we give grants and concessional loans to businesses from this bank, they must give us shares. Those assets go into the fund. Barbadians benefit. As described in the 2018 manifesto, nobody can have a quarrel with that. We are often told you only criticize, but I am suggesting something that is the government's idea, that they operationalize it, that they say to people who come, you must set up a special purpose vehicle for this loan. You got money, most of them have money so they could afford the low management costs. Set up a special purpose vehicle so that you cannot come and tell us, but I can't give you shares because the structure of my company. So obliterate that opportunity to block shareholding. Give shares to the government of Barbados. The government talks about 30% of electricity license shares going to credit unions. Everybody doesn't belong to a credit union. We're talking about a fund that the government says will benefit everybody. Put the shares in there, earn the returns. If they want high returns, okay, sure, but we will get some. It won't all be going into the pockets of shareholders who probably in the main will be outside of this country, which has its own implications. So, Mr. President, we have an opportunity with this bank. I support it. I would say with reservation, because I want to see how it will benefit us. I want to see that we ensure that the affected sectors are properly managed. Regulation does not necessarily mean slow or cumbersome or setting up barriers. It means properly. We can take some of the money that is put into the bank to facilitate that also, Mr. President, technical assistance so that the entities that will be set up or that exist to regulate will be properly resourced. Knowledge, people, and whatever other resources they need. We have to modernize. And on that note, I also want to say this. We cannot continue to regulate electricity on cost of service mechanism. And we're talking about transition. But that is what we're doing. We are regulating on a cost of service basis, which the entire utility regulatory environment understands that that is a recipe for over-earning and inefficiency, which obviously pushes up costs. The answer, however, isn't to say don't regulate. The answer is to modernize and resource regulation to make it fit for purpose for us. So we must ignore the voices that say, let it be a free-for-all, we can set our own rates, or let an individual politician set a rate. We must ignore those voices, and we must do it properly for the sake of the people. Mr. President, I've said it twice already, and I will say it again. The bank is a good initiative. Developmentally, it is necessary because we do know that we need to have development financial instruments or organizations, but we have to use it for the benefit of the people, not just the applicants who come for the money. And the bank has to use all of its resources to also facilitate and encourage new corporate initiatives, new industry development, ensure that Barbadians who truly need, using the terminology that is used by the Smart Fund, can show that they have a need. We have to encourage our young people as well in modern technologies and modern industries, and this bank can be a vehicle for that. And for those reasons, I will support the initiative, but it has to redound to the benefit of all of the people, not just the people who can get a good business plan, get some investors, and come to the bank to ask for some extra money at low rates or come and ask for a grant. Mr. President, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Watson. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise, first of all, to speak to the bill itself, to respond to a number of things which have been raised, many of them inaccuracies, and I wish to clarify them for the benefit of our listening public. Mr. President, first of all, the Blue-Green Bank and the bill which is before us establishes the bank as a merchant bank. And by definition, Mr. President, the merchant bank means that it will allow for the provision of capital, including by loans and any other forms as so defined by the structure of the bank, to business enterprises. That's the nature of a merchant bank. And so it is not a development bank, neither is it a commercial bank, it is a merchant bank. And there are very clear distinctions on how an entity incorporated under the Companies Act as a merchant bank and falling under the Financial Services Commission and the Central Bank is expected to function. And I want to put that up front, Mr. President, because that frames the construct for the bank's operations itself. Mr. President, there are significant tranches of resources to which the Honourable Minister who introduced the bill spoke about, resources coming in from CAF, resources coming in from the GCF, resources coming in from a number of agencies to be able to capitalize the bank, and we have seen that number aggregated as indicated by the Honourable Minister who introduced it. Those funds, Mr. President, are co-financing funds, in particular for those from the GCF, and the GCF has a 50-50 co-financing arrangement for this particular bank and how it is being capitalized. One of those tranches of funds, Mr. President, there are 3 areas where the bank was to be co-financed under the tranche provided by the GCF. Those areas include the buzzwords to which we have just heard the Honourable Leader of Opposition Business refer, the buzzwords that have generated capital investment from the GCF. Those buzzwords are mitigation in the first instance, adaptation in the second instance, Mr. President, and under adaptation, excuse me, under mitigation, energy generation and access, and I will speak some about that. The second 2 areas from the GCF in its initial capitalization, Mr. President, spoke about health and well-being and water security, therefore explaining why the Honourable Member who introduced the bill spoke about water security. The second area under adaptation is infrastructure and the built environment. And so, Mr. President, those would be the areas that capture the co-financing arrangements under the GCF. And why would that be so, Mr. President? In the initial pipeline for the Blue-Green Bank, there are a number of core projects to which the Honourable Member, when he introduced the bill in the other place several weeks ago now, spoke. Those initiatives covered under the Roofs to Reefs program, which has been a long-standing program of the government, which is anchored in the office of the Prime Minister. They cover, Mr. President, the home ownership providing energy housing projects, which focus on a specific demographic that does not fall within high income or the persons who are the major owners of capital. These are housing projects, Mr. President, that are designed to ensure that persons have access to housing. It is meant, therefore, Mr. President, also to cover under a second tranche of resources the Small Homes Income Generating Facility Trust, SHIFT programs. Who does that refer to, Mr. President? Those who are in the lower and low income category so that there is affordability for people. Those are the elements captured in the initial pipeline of the project. So we have HOPE on the one hand and SHIFT that I have just outlined what it refers to. Mr. President, under the energy generation and access, I want to come back to the macro framing before I come into the details, Mr. President, because it's fine to be, hollering and screaming from the mountaintop where we're talking about some of these things, but I want to take a moment in sober reflection over these issues. Mr. President, I have sat over the last, I want to say, a year and a half, not in a theoretical sense, but in a real sense, engaging with independent power producers, the utility on the one hand, the regulator on the other hand, the international financial institutions on the other hand, the local financial institutions on the other hand, the stakeholders, Mr. President, representing both the Green Council of the Chamber of Commerce as well as the Barbados Renewable Energy. I have made it my business to give a 360 view of all of the various perspectives that have come to weigh in on these matters that capture the first tranche of resources under the GCF allocation of 50% co-financing to the Blue-Green Bank. And here's what I have encountered, Mr. President, and it is the reason why we've spent a considerable amount of time. Last week, Mr. President, I also spent some time meeting with partners from the European Investment Bank, meeting with partners from the European Directorate for Partnerships for International Development. And why, Mr. President? Because the minister who introduced the bill spoke about the Bridgetown Initiative, another buzzword as the opposition members would have it to be called, which talks about access to financing, but more importantly, the reform of the international financial institutions, but for the purposes of financing energy and the renewable energy transition in particular, affordable financing. And when I say affordable financing, Mr. President, here's what I'm talking about. I call it stacking. One night, Mr. President, in a meeting, it was around 9 o'clock, and we had been meeting for some time, and I remember taking a series of cell phones belonging to all of us sitting around the table, and I started to put the cell phone side by side by side by side, one after the other. And it was to create a visual impact, Mr. President, on the things that we were encountering in affordability of financing. Let me make the record clear. There is no challenge that we have encountered in energy generation for either small or large persons to access financing. The market is awash with capital historically. And we have a number of people, small and large, who have gone to financial institutions of all kinds and have been able to attract financing. In the larger lumpy category of capital, Mr. President, and let us be clear, the very attractive feed-in tariffs predate this administration and date themselves back in an administration that came before us. They were highly incentivized, and we understand it. I'm not even knocking it. Because if you read the International Financial Institutions' own analysis, when you are beginning a new sector in its nascent stage, you tend to incentivize the market by having higher tariffs up front. So I'm not knocking it per se, Mr. President. That's the reality, and that was the advice then, and so you can see the rationale for it now. The fact, however, Mr. President, that you may have a life cycle of 25 years in a project, but that you are able to get a rate of return continuously over the duration of that life cycle is perhaps where the challenge comes. Because if we have had to do it on our side, there may have been a step-down tariff where you recoup your investment perhaps up front, and then over time you have a reduced rate of return, but not have 25 years of return at the same level that would have been incentivized initially, perhaps. But that's a theoretical consideration that you see in some of the literature. It's not necessarily what is going to be applicable to Barbados, so I'm not knocking it.
Mr. President, on a point of clarification, while the initial feed-in tariffs were set under the previous administration, they have been revised. And what is theoretically being suggested is actually not what has been done. So that mechanism has continued. Some of the rates have been raised, as a matter of fact, and particularly in the band where you would expect them to go down, because that band can benefit from economies of scale and scope, Mr. President. I just want to clarify that so that the public understands why our levelized cost of energy is not actually going down.
Senator Cummins, please proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. In the case of Barbados, as I was saying just now, there is a recommendation certainly from my own ministry and from this government that we do need to look at the feed-in tariffs. And it is on that basis, Mr. President, that we have already, through the Fair Trading Commission, conducted an assessment in the first instance of the current feed-in tariffs for generation. There is ongoing, as we speak, a review of the feed-in tariff for storage for the pilot at 50 megawatts that was issued in June of last year. That work is underway. And so if I had been allowed to finish my statement, it would have been allowed to have the update, Mr. President, as to where we are now. So there is no question that there has to be a revision in this moment, Mr. President, because the costs of supplies have definitively, without question, gone down. So, Mr. President, here is where I want to go back very quickly to dealing with the stacking of the cell phones that I spoke about earlier. Mr. President, the Bridgetown Initiative was launched when I started to speak about affordability, because when I put those cell phones together, Mr. President, and shared with our partners what we were dealing with in terms of affordability, it was a visual construct, Mr. President. What we started to do was to focus, first of all, you had the fuel adjustment clause, one charge. You have a feed-in tariff for generation. If you put in a feed-in tariff for storage, here is what it is. And then we started to look, Mr. President, at what would have been some of the proposals coming in under international financial institutions in affordability and bankability of capital. And what do I mean when I say things like that, Mr. President? There are a number of provisions, Mr. President, that we have been arguing are not applicable to countries that are like Barbados. And the inclusion of those mechanisms within financial institutions that come from outside of our borders is making the cost of capital too expensive for our country and therefore for the end consumers and for the persons who are going in as the applicants. And what do I mean? There are a number of measures, Mr. President, that we have been battling against and we have been working through with our partners. They include things like What should be the inclusion of liquidity support? Those are measures that we are seeing in a lot of the instruments that are coming now. What should be early capacity payments, fixed term capacity payments, Mr. President? What should be the provision as well for unilateral termination? And then there's a measure, for example, that includes things like political force majeure, change of law provisions. There are all kinds of measures that are included in bankability provisions that have a cost to capital. And if those are not the mechanisms, Mr. President, to which the Bridgetown Initiative refers, to make sure that countries like Barbados do not get the large transfer of capital, yes, but at a high cost, then I don't know what is. So it may sound like a buzzword to some, but for the practical application of it, it is anything but. Because when you start to stack costs, and you start to include those things in power purchase agreements then with the utility, you have a problem, yes, to the consumer. So the Bridgetown Initiative, access to affordable financing, resilience in that financing, and sustainability financing, those are the things that will then, in my view, Mr. President, be well vested in a bank that is created by us, for us, and in our interest, Mr. President. And the Blue-Green Bank, as it is currently being contemplated, is meant to ensure that there is a financial institution that covers the issues in the blue, in the green economy, and everything in between, Mr. President, at rates of capital and rates of credit that can be afforded by countries like ours. It is the reason, Mr. President, why we have seen institutions being set up all over the world, in different parts of the world. There is an Inter-American Development Bank, there is an African Development Bank. Those are development bank institutions, Mr. President. But in a merchant bank environment, where most of the technology, if not all of the technology, Mr. President, is imported, there is an FX consideration. And so the FX drain, if 100% of it is coming out of the domestic space as opposed to the external space,
just for the record,
foreign exchange?
please expand on the acronym so that the Hansen reporters and those listening.
Thank you, Mr. President. I apologize.
Foreign exchange.
Foreign exchange component of the project. What we're working on now, Mr. President, is a combination of blended capital, Barbados dollar denominated loans as well as foreign exchange denominated loans, and to make sure that we can remove some of the bankability issues that we have been seeing in the financial instruments. We've also been looking at, Mr. President, a different qualification of blended capital. In a historical sense and in a traditional conservative sense, blended capital referred only to loan or equity. In this instance, a blue-green bank allows us to have affordable capital, grant and equity, and yes, Mr. President, have under the Bridgetown Initiative in the reforms, a discussion around how we can integrate grant capital into that. And that brings me, Mr. President, because I know my time is almost through, that brings me, Mr. President, to the qualifications that I wanted to make. The Smart Energy Fund, Mr. President, was administered not just by the Enterprise Growth Fund. It was administered by both the Growth Fund, Enterprise Growth Fund for larger scale businesses, and Fund Access for smaller businesses, Mr. President. The Enterprise Growth Fund Limited administered the Smart Energy Fund for larger scale businesses, and Fund Access administer the equivalent program. They are the joint fund managers for the Energy Smart Fund. It is not accurate that any one or the other administered those funds. In fact, I am told that the company which was referred to as having accessed a loan went forward initially for the loan and then did not continue with it. So it is unfortunate, Mr. President.
Mr. President, on a point of clarification, I made no references to loans, I made references to technical assistance grants, and I named several companies, so I really would rather if the minister was clear on if the honourable member was clear on what company she's referring to. Also, I want to say again, there were specific parameters that spoke to small and medium enterprises. That's not controversial either. The issue is who has access to the loans and what are the benefits.
Thank you. Senator Collins.
Mr. President, I repeat, the Enterprise Growth Fund and the Fund Access were joint fund managers for the Smart Energy Fund, and they both had different categories of businesses to which they were open to applications. It was not just the Enterprise Growth Fund, it was Fund Access as well. Mr. President, under Fund Access and EGFL, there was a provision for both loans and grants to be applied, Mr. President. Both loans and grants. Large businesses for large projects, small businesses for smaller projects, Mr. President. And in the case of Fund Access, which happens to sit under my ministry, so I'm not asking, in the case of Fund Access, Mr. President, you had a number of persons coming in for projects for an initial capitalization for small projects, and then they wanted to come back and expand their work, and they came back several times to be able to increase the amount of capital that was available to them to be able to scale their projects up, Mr. President. I want to make that abundantly clear, Mr. President. We also saw, Mr. President, the end of that project several years ago. I believe that the Smart Energy Fund ended 2 years ago or somewhere thereabouts, Mr. President. That fund has been closed. I am also pleased to say, and the Honourable Member who introduced the bill is aware of this as well, even though the project has ended, we have done in my ministry an assessment of the projects that were executed under that project to see where they are now, to see how they fit into the energy efficiency agenda of the government now, to see what the annual energy savings have been from the investments made then, Mr. President. We have just submitted that work, not just, several months ago now, we submitted that work to Cabinet for review, and it is the commitment of the government through my ministry to create a dedicated team internal to the Ministry of Energy to ensure that we are able to monitor the continuous use of energy efficiency mechanisms arising from the work of the Smart Fund that ended 2 years ago, notwithstanding that the time has concluded. So, Mr. President, I want to lend my support to the creation of this bill. I want to support the creation of this bill because, Mr. President, it gives Barbados the opportunity to have a say as a country and as a region in ensuring that the mechanisms that go into creating bankability of projects and de-risking projects so that investors or lenders do not end up with what they term as stranded assets, that those things are designed in our interests and in our image, notwithstanding that there must always be a rate of return on investments and certainly a repayment scheme for loans. I am supporting the Blue-Green Bank, Mr. President, because the initial pipeline aligns with the objectives and the philosophy of this government to focus on small as well as large projects. I am supporting the Blue-Green Bank bill, Mr. President, because it aligns with what we do not see as the buzzwords, but we see as part of our existence, Mr. President: sustainable financing, resilience, mitigation, adaptation, and mitigating against questions relating to vulnerability. I am supporting the bank, the Blue-Green Bank, Mr. President, because it allows Barbados to build on its overall agenda of climate advocacy, and yes, energy transition, and yes, as well, Mr. President, ensuring that that transition is just and it anchors people. People who are big are people. People who are small are people. They are all people, and they are all Barbadians. And we are committed to ensuring that there is space for all. And there are any number of projects led by this government that suggest, Mr. President, that that is a philosophy that we live by. And I want to commend this bill to this honourable chamber, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummings. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of the sitting of the House until 2:20 p.m.
The question is that the sitting be suspended until 2:20 p.m. today. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The sitting is suspended until 2:20 p.m. today.